Good afternoon, everybody. Today is March 25th, 2025. This is SEVA VentRounds, and today we're going to be talking about Franken-PRVC, and this is when taxonomy comes to the rescue. Disclosures: there is no endorsement of any mode, ventilator, or manufacturer. We love all ventilators and all modes and all manufacturers. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. Those are my disclosures and Rob's. Just remember to keep your microphone muted, and we may call upon you to comment, or if you want to comment, just unmute yourself and comment, but just keep your microphone muted because this is recorded. We monitor the chat on WebEx, and there are continuous education credits if you're a respiratory therapist and if you work at CCF. All right. Key SEVA knowledge is to remember the taxonomy has three parts: the control variable, the breath sequence, and the targeting scheme, and all together gives us what we call the mode tag. And the mode tag essentially gives us a summary of what a ventilator mode does. And it gives it in a kind of a up-level view of what the ventilator does in general, and it helps us characterize how the patient-ventilator interactions will be. I think that today we want to focus on an area that has evolved over the last years, which is understanding the breath sequences, because there are several ways that the breath sequences occur. And this was not entirely evident to us, but as the computer control and options have evolved, we now have many sequences that we thought at the beginning. And so let's start by thinking just about the basic ones. So if we think about CMV, that means that all breaths are mandatory. And a mandatory breath means that it started and ends by the ventilator. So the patient loses control over either the trigger or the cycle or the size of the breath. On the other side, you have the spontaneous breath, so continuous spontaneous ventilation, in which the patient retains the control, the majority of the control of the breath in terms of the size, when it starts and when it ends. So the trigger is by the patient and the cycle is by the patient. So compare that with mandatory, in which the patient can trigger, but it's cycled by the ventilator, or the ventilator triggers and it's cycled by the patient. So, Rob, any comments about these two spontaneous CSV and CMV before we go into IMV?
Just a minor detail: the ventilator controls the size only in volume control. The patient can adjust the size and pressure control, but it's all about the timing. Triggering and cycling control the inspiratory time and the frequency.
Love it. And then you have the intermittent mandatory ventilation, and that just means that there's mandatory and spontaneous breaths that can live together. All right. And this is relevant because when we started mechanical ventilation, the only type that existed was this one over here, which was IMV type 1, in which the mandatory breaths are always delivered at the set rate. So if you set 5 and the patient is breathing 25 breaths per minute, there's going to be 5 mandatory breaths that are going to be delivered through this. They may be synchronized with the patient in terms of the trigger, but there's still going to be 5 mandatory breaths in there. This was the original inception and what the trials were done for weaning and whatnot. It was this type of device. However, as we have evolved, now there's 4 more types that we recognize. So the IMV type 2 means that the mandatory breaths are suppressed if the spontaneous rate appears or is higher than a certain variable. And it's implemented differently on different devices. In some, it's just the presence of them. In others, there has to be a certain apnea time that occurs. But essentially, when the patient starts breathing on its own, the mandatory breaths go away. In IMV type 3, the mandatory breaths are only suppressed if you have reached a spontaneous minute ventilation that is higher than what it's set or you have programmed on the ventilator. So if the patient is breathing spontaneously, but it's not reaching the minute ventilation, it will give mandatory breaths to get you to that level. And then there's two more that are not dependent on the spontaneous rate or the minute ventilation. One of them is IMV type 4, in which essentially a mandatory breath, a breath that was born to be mandatory. So it may have been triggered by the patient, but it was going to be cycled by time. Is changed to spontaneous because the patient does a large inspiratory effort. So that makes the breath go from mandatory to spontaneous. So that's mandatory change to spontaneous. And there is the fifth type, which is IMV5, in which there's spontaneous breaths that now are changed to mandatory. And so that means that the spontaneous breath didn't reach the set inspiratory time, and because of that, it cycles them. It will continue to have an inspiratory time to ensure that the inspiratory effort is of a certain size. Rob?
The important thing from my point of view is that manufacturers don't recognize these and they don't talk about them this way. And that can cause problems for people that are designing large-scale multi-site studies, right? Because they might want to be studying IMV as a mode of ventilation. Let's say volume control IMV versus pressure control IMV. And they just tell the study participants, set it in IMV. But you can see that doesn't necessarily mean they're equivalent modes.
Correct. It's very tricky because you have to read the manual to understand this. And then there's some hints when you're looking at the screens with the control screens, and we'll go over that. But it's not imminently evident to you. And this is where I think the taxonomy helps us understand at least what the ventilator will be doing. And in certain cases, every single one of these IMVs, you could potentially, I like to do the exercise of thinking, what type of patient would this be useful for? In what patient would I want to use a type 1, a type 2, a type 3, a type 4, and a type 5? And when you start thinking about that, it starts giving you some clarity about how to apply this technology. So having said that, let's go into our case. And this is a patient of mine that came in and was placed on non-invasive ventilation. And I'm going to show you the first screen that I saw, and then we're going to analyze it together. There's more to this, but here goes. That's the first screen I saw. And so we're going to take this with peace and love, and we're going to start with the tag, okay? And as you know, the tag has 3 components. So let's start by the first one, and by defining what are we controlling on this breath sequence that you can see here. And again, just to clarify for all of you that are seeing this for the first time, this type of screen on the ventilator, this is on the top is pressure, then there's flow, and on the bottom there's volume. And this is actually non-invasive ventilation. All right. So let's go at what is the breath control variable. So if you want to type it into your there you go. I'm starting to see on the chat. And so the first thing that comes through is the breath control variable is pressure control. And so let's just talk a little bit about that. And we know that what is controlled is pressure. And it's pressure because, first of all, if you look at the flow, every single one of the flow waveforms is different. And you can see actually the pressure has a square waveform throughout, and the volume has varied throughout. So we're definitely not controlling flow during the breath. So we're controlling pressure. You can see that. So, Rob, any comment about pressure?
Not about pressure, no.
No. All righty. So now let's move on into the next part, which is what's the breath sequence okay? And I want to see what you all are doing. So the pressure control, and so what's the breath sequence? CSB, IMB, or CMB? And I see some of you have already put some stuff. Yeah, there you go. So I start seeing some inputs come in. So very good. So there's a good amount of IMB, and many of you are actually putting the types of IMB. So this is very, very interesting to see. So I'm going to put the parentheses for a second. And so what you are seeing here is, so there's a couple of clues. So we know that this is pressure controlled, and we are going to look at what is triggering in this case. And we can see in this case, for some of the breaths, there is the flow crosses, and then it triggers the breath as it crosses the baseline. And each one of the breaths have different sizes. So you can compare this breath, I'm going to call it breath number 3, and breath number 5 are probably the same length, but breath number 1, 2, and 3 seem different. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, and breath 4 seem different lengths. And so that makes us suspect that in this case, on breath 1 and 2, this is probably spontaneous breaths. So they're different I times, and they're finishing, and the breath cycles off at that period of time. Now, I would highlight that this breath over here actually has a little bit of a pause. It did not cross immediately. It kind of did a pause. So this makes me suspect that this was actually a mandatory breath just because of that little pause there. So this one seems to be patient triggered, but machine cycled. This one seems to be patient triggered, and just because of the flow, it's decaying and it shuts off by flow with no shelf at all. I would suspect that this is patient cycled. This one over here looks like it's machine, maybe machine triggered. It's about the same height. It's hard for me to say, so I'm gonna suspect, because I don't see any change on pressure, that this is likely machine, but I may be wrong. And then it's cycled by the flow was continued to go, and then boom, it cycles off, and you can see this little effort right here that makes me think that it's an early cycle, so it's probably machine cycle. So that and this one again, it's another breath, minimal, but maybe patient on machine, but it's cycles. And again, I see this effort here, or this evidence of PMOS, which makes me think that these are machine cycles. So there's a machine, a patient, machine, machine, machine. Rob, thoughts about that?
Well, if you look at breath 3, for example, look at the expiratory flow curve. And you see it abruptly goes through 0 before pressure rises. That would indicate to me an inspiratory effort. So that's probably patient triggered, right?
I agree. I was thinking that too. But because it crossed and it took so much time, and then poof, it triggered. It made me think, but it may be that it's inappropriately, the trigger is inappropriately set, right? So,
and this ventilator doesn't indicate pressure or flow triggering like other ventilators do, right?
No, I think that the changing color, the green, may mean that it's patient triggered. I'm not entirely sure. And somebody, if anybody knows, please put it in the.
That looks more like green is inspiratory time and blue is expiratory time.
It's expiratory. Yeah, makes sense. Well, I disagree, Ariel. This patient has a flow trigger on this ventilator. I'll show you in a second. Alrighty, and then the type of sequence that we see here is, I mean, we're seeing some spontaneous breaths, and so if all of them are patient triggered, then this is definitely not type 2, because we wouldn't expect, we would expect all of them to be patient cycle then under those circumstances. However, there's a trick here that I'll show. But however, I do see this breath that seems to have a mandatory breath. So that would at least make this one a type 5 breath, in which the breath, a spontaneous breath, becomes mandatory. And I'm going to show you just for a second. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. I do know that there's another number that goes here, but this graph doesn't show it to me entirely. I would say I cannot make that determination, at least on this graph. So I'm going to move on. Rob, any other comments about the breath sequence? Do you agree with a 5 there?
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. So there's mandatory and spontaneous breaths. And then the targeting scheme is actually very interesting. If you notice, you see how the pressure goes from breath 1 to breath 2 to breath 3. And look at the tidal volume, how it climbs until it reaches the target tidal volume that was set here at 500. So this would be consistent with what targeting scheme? Yeah, excellent. So this would be adaptive. So it would be adaptive and likely adaptive too. So let me just show you, there's another breath sequence. But here's the screen with the settings for this mode, which helped me because this was the first time that I had interacted clinically with this ventilator. I mean, that I had paid a lot of attention because I had not seen PRVC being given non-invasively. Although I can agree that this has another name on other ventilators, but it said PRVC. So PRVC, the tidal volume is 500, and they said set the PEEP at 5. And then a slope, that's the rise time at 3, an FiO2 of 30. They put a back rate of 12, and then an I to E ratio of 4.6, which I presume that's how you indirectly control the I time in this ventilator. And then you have flow trigger, which is set at auto with flow sensitivity at 2, and then a cycle threshold at 15%. So as you read this, you would just say, well, just reading this screen, I would have read this as being PRVC. If I had read this screen, I would have said this is pc-imv, just by looking at this screen. I would not have said that this is IMV. Although you can see on top the breath sequence, and you can see different size breaths occurring as you're looking at this screen. So there's something certainly that didn't match. But then you see here additional settings. As you click the additional settings, now you have those values, and these values are relevant for us to review. So you have a TI max, so that means that a spontaneous breath may be cycled off if it goes for longer than 2 seconds, right? So a breath that is spontaneous can turn into mandatory because it will be cycled after 2 seconds, or a breath that is too short, TI min, if it's shorter than 0.6 seconds, it will be, the machine will maintain the inspiratory time until 0.6, in spite of the patient had finished earlier. So this is consistent with type IMB type 5, just by itself. 5. Rob, comment?
Nope, that's correct.
And so the other part that I also want you to make aware for these other additional settings is that, and this is present in other modes, in other PRVC type modes, especially non-invasive, in which you can set a minimum pressure. So remember that as the work shifting starts occurring and the patient does more effort, the ventilator is going to deliver less. And you can set, at least on this ventilator, a lower amount of pressure that will not go below that. Even though the patient may be getting a larger tidal volume, it will not go below 10. In other ventilators, it will go all the way down to 0, and you cannot set it up. But in this one, you can set a 10, and you can set a maximum amount of pressure. And if the patient is not reaching that tidal volume, it will not go above 25 of maximum pressure, which is relevant to know and to look at these additional settings, because it may affect, if this is too low and the patient needs more pressure, it may not deliver and you would have ineffective delivery of tidal volume. Comments, Rob?
No, at this point, no comments.
Okay. So that's what we can infer. Now you know why this is a type 5 AA. Now, a thing that you should know is that if you see this breath, this one over here, this sequence, is that not this sequence? It's actually this breath sequence. Give me a second. Yeah, it's this one over here. So this one is a breath sequence for this patient later on. And you can see that every breath is being cycled by the patient now. And every single one of them has different inspiratory times. You can actually see that here it was a very long one. So that means that the mandatory breaths have been suppressed. And so this is the only, I'm sorry, this is the only breath sequence that I have to show you that shows that, but that converts this mode essentially on an IMV type 2 type of mode. And so this mode is pc-imv 2. So meaning if all the breaths are spontaneous, they will suppress the mandatory. And type 5, in which spontaneous breaths may be converted into mandatory if the Tmax, the Tmean or Tmax are met with an adaptive targeting. I saw a hand raise up. I don't see it anymore. Oh, yes, I see it. Ariel, go ahead, please.
Eduardo, I tested this mode many times on the
Good.
lab and manually using the test log and everything. Those settings that you display, so you say that the spontaneous breath is turned into a mandatory just because of the, let's say, minimum night time and the maximum. So being the maximum, a protective one. So is that enough to say that the breath is turning into a mandatory one, or when somebody accidentally said something in the wrong way to say that it's a IMV5 versus IMV type 2?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that every mode can be set inappropriately, right? But if a breath is being turned into mandatory, either by the team inappropriately set inspiratory time minimum or maximum, still it's being converted into a mandatory breath. So by definition, that would be. But I would let Rob comment on that.
Yeah, there's a couple of comments. One, for IMV type 5, we disregard the TI max setting because, as you said, Ariel, that is in the case of, let's say, a massive leak or non-invasive ventilation, and pressure support just doesn't work. But if the patient makes a very small inspiratory effort, like his neural inspiratory time is 0.2 seconds, then the ventilator says, no, you can't shut off the breath that quickly. It has to be at least 0.6 seconds in this case. So it's time cycled, it's a mandatory breath. And the engineers designed that so that the patient doesn't get an excessively small tidal volume just because they made a small effort. So because what could happen is the patient could be making a bunch of small efforts and getting a bunch of small tidal volumes and not really ventilating, even though it was on pressure support, it wasn't getting the full pressure support.
And that does happen with some patients with neuromuscular disease, especially a non-invasive ventilation.
And one other thing I want to point out, we don't say this just because we figured it out by looking at the waveforms. Let me read to you what the manual says. For PVREC, it says, applied inspiratory positive area pressure is automatically adjusted to obtain the set tidal volume. Okay, that's adaptive targeting. When there is no pressure support ventilation or spontaneous breathing within the set time, mandatory ventilation is performed. So that clearly indicates that you have both spontaneous and mandatory breaths, and that's why it's IMV type 2. Now, the manual could be clear and say that the spontaneous breaths suppress the mandatory breaths, but manufacturers don't recognize that at this point.
I have no doubt that it's IMV type 2. I can tell you that this is one of the cases where the taxonomy can make you point that this PRVC is not the PRVC as in any other machine. My questioning is, it's hard for me to get that it's IMV type 5.
Well, we can talk about this offline, but
Yeah.
we have published a description of this in Respiratory Care Journal in a recent letter to the editor.
Right. And so, here is the clear example of a spontaneous breath being becoming into a mandatory. So just in terms of taxonomy, that's what we would say. So so let's move on. Now that you have seen that, in this case, what do you think is the load on this patient? And Annika, you would not be able to differentiate this from volume support if all the patient was triggering all the breaths. It would be you would not be able to see that unless you have all these breath sequences. So what is the load? Yeah, there's a fair amount of PMOS on this patient. Yeah, good job. During inspiration, there's a fair amount of PMOS, and I'll just show you just for the sake of your eyesight, but you can potentially see on this waveform how it takes a fair amount of time to reach baseline. So it's taking a long, and actually during inspiration, you can see how it plateaus and it never reaches baseline. It takes a long period of time to get there. This patient had severe COPD, so there's also an increase on resistive load. But on this waveform, it's hard to see, frankly. Now, in terms of the PV discordance, what type of discordance do you see? In terms of trigger, is it normal, early, late, false, or failed? And I'm going to show you this image here. This may help you a little bit more. Yeah. So, I mean, there's features here that talk about late trigger. I think that this one over here makes me suspicious for a late trigger as well as this one. It takes a while to, so I agree with you, Anika, on this one. This one looks like a late trigger. And then I will highlight, you see this little hump over here as well as this hump over here after an exponential decay. You see the exponential decay, and then the hump. This makes me concerned for a failed trigger on these patients, and so there's late and there's failed, and it becomes more evident right here with this one and this one over here, and it becomes even more evident on this over here. You see that one, this one. So there's another one here, and another one here. So with all these are classic when you have high resistive load. These are the items that you expect to find. So you expect to find your late triggers as well as failed. So that's what you're seeing here in this efforts that the patient is having. So with that, we're at half an hour. Rob, any other comments that you have?
Just very quickly, if we had gone on to looking at the inspiration and cycle and looking at, for example, the expiratory waveforms, it looks to me like on the flow waveform, the peaks are being clipped.
Oh, yeah.
So there's distorted only because of the scaling on the ventilator. And I don't know if you can adjust this. Ariel, can you adjust this on the fly?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Yes, you can. You have to touch the scale and adjust it.
Okay.
And it's not, there's no auto scale on this one, Rob. You have to adjust.
So that's why it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very crude numbers that you can choose.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think it goes to 100 and then to 150 or something like that.
Yeah.
Very good. What else? So, but I didn't see any issues with inspiration otherwise in general, and the cycle, I thought it was normal. and expiration, just some expiratory work, it seems to be occurring at times. Anything else?
Nothing I see.
All righty. Yeah, actually, this patient was having some major issues with the ventilator, so we adjusted, and he got better with it. So the key findings, the first one is just remember the taxonomy can help you immensely, and sometimes you don't have the time to go over the careful analysis of this. So just remember the Vent Mode app has this, every single one of these ventilators on. This one is under portable, although we have discussed how we're gonna move them because it's under a portable ventilator, but it gives non-invasive and invasive. We reviewed what the 5 types of IMV are, and we saw one in which it was type 2, so it suppresses the mandatory just by the presence of a respiratory rate, and we saw type 5, in which what we see is spontaneous breath becoming mandatory by the sake of a minimum inspiratory time. And in this case, the patient also had features of high resistance, and that was leading to 2 discordances. One of them was a late trigger and failed triggers. And so the take-home message is, whatever ventilator you are working with, I would recommend that you go read it, try to see what's the taxonomy for each one of the modes that you're going to be used more frequently, so you understand what the interactions are going to be with the patient. This is the code for the CCF caregivers. This is our QR codes. Remember that now we have the SEVA course available for all of you, so you can register at this QR code. There's all these prior episodes, and please send us your images. And that's the SEVA program. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.